So Luke chapter 13, if you want to go ahead and turn there. Luke chapter 13, we're going to read there. We're going to read over in Mark. We're also going to read in chapter 14 of Luke. You know, we've been going through the life of Christ chronologically. And admittedly, there are some things that we have skipped over, partially because of them being in the book of John, and we spent so much time in John, I didn't want to just rehash information that we had already gone over at length. Another reason in skipping some of the events is it might be that they are repeated, from one gospel account to another, and so we're not going to cover them 2 or 3 times. This morning, we're going to read a couple of sections of Scripture, Gesundheit, and then we're going to spend most, if not all of our time looking at the Sabbath. Part of the reason for that is because I think that we can really kind of condense things down if we look at some of these issues, some of the things that Christ was doing on the Sabbath, and consider the Sabbath, and then we won't have to cover those events later necessarily. Also, because our Wednesday class we're looking at those questions that new Christians might have. And so we're going to be looking at more detail on the Sabbath. You know, why is Sunday the first day of the week? Why do we worship on Sunday, not on Saturday, and what have you, as Seventh-day Adventists do? So, did anybody have any questions so far of anything that we've looked at? Okay. So Luke chapter 13, like I said, we just want to read a couple of things. We'll take note, and then we'll look at the Sabbath using these texts and going back and forth, and hopefully learn a little bit more of the Sabbath of the Jews. So Luke chapter 13, reading verses 10 through 17. These readings are all going to be taking place on the Sabbath. And so Luke chapter 13, beginning in verse 10, reading through verse 17. And he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And behold, there was a woman who for 18 years had a sickness caused by a spirit, and she was bent double and could not straighten up at all. And when Jesus saw her, he called her over and said to her, "Woman, you are freed from your sickness." And he laid his hands upon her, and immediately she was made erect again and began glorifying God. And the synagogue official, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, began saying to the multitude in response, "There are 6 days in which work should be done. Therefore, come during them and get healed, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites, does not each of you, on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the stall and lead him away to water him? And this woman, a daughter of Abraham as she is, whom Satan has bound for 18 long years, should she not have been released from this bond on the Sabbath day?" And as he said this, all his opponents were being humiliated, and the entire multitude was rejoicing over all the glorious things being done by him. So just a couple of things to notice here before we go to our next reading is, do you notice that the synagogue official, he did not dispute Christ being able to heal anyone? If you remember, when Christ had healed before, what did they say about his healing? That he cast out demons by what? By the power of the devil, by Satan, by Beelzebub, depending on your translation. And so, but here the synagogue official, he's not denying the power that Jesus has. And he's not condemning it either. He's not even addressing Jesus. He sees what Jesus has done, he recognizes it, but then he turns to the crowd and says, "Look, if you want to be healed, just don't come on the Sabbath." Yeah, or for us, it'd be Sunday, right? Come tomorrow, or come the next day, or let him heal you then. And Jesus, he makes this observation that on the Sabbath, these people, they'll take their ox, they'll take their donkey, and they'll untie them, they'll lead them from the stall over to get water to drink. And yet here is a woman who, Genesis 1:26 and 27, is created in the image of God. Remember Genesis 1:26 and 27? So, let us make man in our own image after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And so made them male and female. He made them, right? So she's in the image of God, and for 18 years she has had this issue. And it's, if you're going to take this ox out of the stall and lead it to water, how much more does this woman who has been bound for 18 years deserve healing, deserve to be released from this? And so they're being humiliated because on the one side, if they say, well, she doesn't deserve to be, then one, they're lacking common sense. It's like, okay, so you're saying that an animal is more important than someone who is created in the image of God. That's what you're saying. And on the other hand, and so they're being shown as being heartless and careless, lacking any type of common sense. And so that's the two kind of observations there. One, that he did not deny Jesus' power to heal. He simply told the people to come back at another time. And then two is the observation that Christ makes. Now, it's the Lord answered him. He wasn't even addressing Christ. But Jesus answered him. He got involved. He could have just left it there. He could have just said, this is a synagogue official. He is talking to the people, which, by the hierarchy, the religious hierarchy that's going on, he has every right to do. But no, Jesus saw something that was being taught that was in error. And so he steps in the middle of it. A responsibility that we all have. And so then let's turn over to chapter 14. So just a page over. Chapter 14. Luke chapter 14. Any questions or comments on Luke chapter 13 that we looked at there? Okay, so Luke chapter 14, looking at verses 1 through 6. And it came about when he went into the house of one of the leaders of the Pharisees on the Sabbath to eat bread, that they were watching him closely. And there in front of him was a certain man suffering from dropsy. And Jesus answered and spoke to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? But they kept silent. And he took hold of him and healed him and sent him away. And he said to them, which of you shall have a son or an ox fall into a well and will not immediately pull him out on a Sabbath day? And they could make no reply to this. So we're going to come back to this. There's just one other thing that I want to read, and then we'll come back over to Luke 14. You can turn there if you like. It'd be Mark chapter 3. Mark chapter 3, or you can just stay there in Luke chapter 14. We'll be coming back to it. But Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. And he entered again into a synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand, and they were watching him to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath, in order that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, rise and come forward. And he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save a life or to kill? But they kept silent. And after looking around at them with anger, grieved at the hardness of heart, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And the Pharisees went out immediately began taking counsel with the Herodians against him as to how they might destroy him. So a couple of things going back to Luke chapter 14. First of all, dropsy, if you don't know, is it's a condition. It's an abnormal swelling. It's like fluid and water retention, generally caused by an issue with the kidneys or the heart or what have you. So there is a physical, I'll say, deformity that you can see. It's something physical, not biological in the sense that it's inherited, but it's physical condition. So it's kind of obvious there. Now, when we look over, or when we see there in, they say here at the end of verse 1 that they were watching him closely. There in Luke chapter 14, the end there, they were watching him closely. And they were watching him closely, just as we read over in Mark chapter 3, to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. And in seeing that over in Mark chapter 3, that's when, they kind of decided that they were going to set out as to how to destroy him. One, because he had considered himself equal with God, and two, because he was performing these things on the Sabbath. They would actually accuse, over in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 2, the disciples of doing unlawful things on the Sabbath. When they're walking along, they're going by these grain fields and taking some of the grain, they would accuse them of doing what was unlawful on the Sabbath as well. Now, when we're looking at this account in Luke chapter 14, that's the thing about Scripture, is that if we're not careful, we can easily read sometimes even a single verse and just miss things that are in there that just really kind of stand out to us. We see here in chapter 14 of Luke that he is in the house of one of the leaders of the Pharisees on the Sabbath. Now that's no big deal, right? I mean, the Pharisees, they were known for inviting popular figures, even those maybe that they disagreed with, into their homes for a meal on the Sabbath. Part of the reason was to keep in line with the people, because if you had popular people rising up and people were following them and paying attention to them, but then the Pharisees were stood off. Now, the word Pharisee, we know, means a separatist, right? So they were already kind of separate from the people. You don't want to distance yourself even more. So it's not unusual to see Christ in the home of one of the Pharisees on the Sabbath. What is unusual, though? The man with dropsy. See, the Jews during this time, they believed that people who had these types of physical ailments, that they had sinned in some way against God. We think of Job, right? And losing the animals, losing his children, and all of this. And what did his quote-unquote friends say? They accused him of doing something against God. He brought it on himself. Even in Isaiah chapter 53, the suffering servant, it was that it pleased God to smite him, but we counted it as that Jesus, we, the prophet, saying that we counted it as though Jesus had done something against God. So the unusual thing here is not that Jesus is in the Pharisee's house, it's the man with this physical ailment, dropsy, is in the Pharisee's house. They would have wanted to have stayed away from him. So why do we think that the man was there? Based on the readings that we had here in Luke 13, Luke 14, and over there in Mark chapter 3, what were they watching for? To see what? To see if he was going to heal on the Sabbath. And so really, this man is there as a test for Christ. If you write in your Bibles, then you might circle that there and just write bait next to it. They were baiting Christ to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. And so that's kind of one of the interesting things that we find there. And when we see this, now Jesus answered and spoke. It says there in front of him was a certain man suffering from dropsy. And Jesus answered and spoke to the lawyers and Pharisees. Now we know that the lawyers, they are not like lawyers today arguing, they were arguing, but not in a courtroom as we would think today, right? Shakespeare once said the first thing we should do is kill all the lawyers, right? But these lawyers, they are doctors of the law. They are theologians of the Mosaic law, kind of knowing it inside and out. But we don't have a record that they asked him a question. It just says that there was a man there and that Jesus answered. But what did he answer if they didn't ask him a question? Now, what does it say about Jesus elsewhere in the New Testament? Is that he knows what about men?
He knows their hearts.
Yeah, he knows their hearts. He knows their thoughts. And this would not be the only occasion that Christ would address the thoughts of men. In fact, there are places where it says, knowing their thoughts, he said. He knew what it is that they were trying to do. You cannot pull the wool over God's eyes. That's just not going to happen, right? But so he answers them, spoke to them there in verse 3. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? And they were silent about it. Now, a couple of things, and again, we're going to spend some time here in looking at the Sabbath so that when we come to these other events in Christ's life, we're not having to rehash the same material. And then, like I said, on Wednesday, we'll go over the Sabbath even more. So, Jesus, we have him healing on the Sabbath, but it was not what we would necessarily consider a typical practice. In fact, when we look over at Mark chapter 1, Mark chapter 1 there near the end in verse 32. And when evening had come, after the sun had set, they began bringing to him all who were ill and those who were demon possessed. It's after the Sabbath, waiting until that evening, because we remember that the Jewish day, it began in the evening, started in the morning, and that coming from Genesis, and there was evening and morning the first day, evening and morning the second day, and so that's how their day started, and so they would wait until after the Sabbath. Now, Christ, I'm sure, would have healed on the Sabbath based on the other events and what have you, but the people, they were bound by what they had heard for many generations. Let's look at a couple of things. Over in Exodus chapter 31, any questions or comments so far, though, as we're going over to Exodus 31? It's just one verse there in Exodus chapter 31. It's Exodus 31 and verse 13. Exodus 31 and verse 13, where it's saying that it is a sign of the covenant. Questions, comments, complaints? Okay. Exodus 31 and verse 13, beginning in verse 12, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "But as for you, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, you shall surely observe my Sabbath, for this is a sign between me and you and throughout your generations, that you may know I am the Lord who sanctifies you." Now let's turn over to Numbers chapter 15. So we have that the Sabbath is a sign of the covenant. And then we go over to Numbers chapter 15, and we see a punishment for not keeping the Sabbath. This is Numbers chapter 15, verses 32 through 36. Now, while the sons of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering wood on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation. And they put him in custody because it had not been declared what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, "The man shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp." So all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones, just as the Lord had commanded. So the Sabbath is a sign of the covenant between God and God's people. in breaking that covenant or in transgressing that sign, in this case the man gathering wood, the punishment was death. Because if you weren't going to honor just a part of the covenant, then you're not going to honor any of it. It's very much the New Testament. If you transgress in one part of the law, you've transgressed in what? All of the law. And so we have kind of this issue here. A couple of things, about the Sabbath. About the Sabbath, there's an explanation, this fourth commandment in Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8, that's the command. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Okay? And then verse 9, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So the question becomes, what qualifies as work? Right? Because the Sabbath day, it is a sign of the covenant between God and God's people. And he says that you're going to labor these 6 days. That's when you do all of your work. But the Sabbath day, you're not going to do any work. So what then classifies as work? That's kind of the problem that people are dealing with here. Is what Christ was doing a work? Now, there are certain things, and I'll tell you, the reason that this became so confusing for the people is because originally the commandments were given in what type of form? Not a trick question, I promise you. Well, written form. But because of the tablets, right? So originally it's written form. And the law then, it's copied by scribes for centuries. We have that they are read by kings and what have you, so it's done that for centuries. Now, after the Babylonian exile, the religious leaders, they start developing rules. These oral laws, as they're called. And at about 200 AD, these moral laws, or these oral laws, they were added to the Mosaic law, right? They're compiled, they're written down, and they become the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah is basically a commentary on the Torah, those 5 books of Moses, and the law that's in there. Now, for every one law, they would actually add on 5 different laws. Okay? So we think of how difficult it is to be a Jew during this time, right? So for every one law, they'd add on another 5 laws. In fact, and we've gone over some of these laws before, in fact, they had 30 chapters just on washing dishes, on pots and plates and copper cups and all of that, I don't even like reading the manual to my dishwasher, okay? You're going to give me 30 chapters just on washing dishes. And from our class in John, if you remember when we talked about some of the laws, and I was reading from that code of Jewish law, it was, for example, you could spit on the ground. That wasn't against the law, but if you took your foot and for whatever reason rubbed your foot in the spit, that was breaking the law. I don't know why you would do that anyways. Maybe you had something on your shoe, but that would be breaking the law. Now, so they had 30 chapters just on washing dishes. We're adding 5 oral laws to every law that God had given. And then we have the Gemara, which is a commentary on the Mishnah. So just to kind of clear it up, you have the law of God, And then you have the Mishnah, which is a commentary on the law of God. And then you have the Gemara, which is a commentary on the law of God. Okay? So you couldn't really just go to the law of God. You'd have to go to this over here. And then because this didn't necessarily make sense, then you'd have to go over here. Right? And so then when you have the Mishnah combined with the Gemara, that creates what's called the Talmud. Okay, so you've got the law, you've got the commentary on the law, you've got the commentary on the law, and then when you take the two commentaries and put them together, you have the Talmud. Now, you would think, I mean, after all, we have a Bible. It has 66 books in it, right? So, okay, they could probably fit all of that into one volume. The Talmud actually consists of 500 books compiled into 22 volumes. Okay? And now you think about it, they were not all published, at that time or what have you. That's why a lot of it was oral law. In fact, many didn't come till years later. So, there's this oral law that people are focusing on there. There's there's 39 categories of activities, and each category has a subcategory. It's just pretty much. I'll give you some examples. If you had like let's say you have a really deep cut, okay, and not a paper cut, a really deep cut, and you're just bleeding, right? Someone could come along, or you could, and you could wrap the wound. That was okay because it might be a life or death situation. But you could not do stitches. You couldn't you couldn't go out to your aloe plant in the front yard and put anything like that on it because it had been taken away. So you've already saved the life just by bandaging the wound. Stitches and ointments and neosporin and all of that have to wait till the next day. Okay? Right? If you broke a bone, let's say you're going after one of these oxen that have fallen in a ditch, and you break a bone, you're going to have to wait for the bone for that to be set because it's not a life-threatening situation. So we're going to have you suffer through the Sabbath, and then you can see a doctor. Peggy said, Old Testament painkiller, just give me some, that first century Jack Daniels or something over here. No. Ladies, you'll be happy to know, though, that if you were pregnant, you could be assisted on the Sabbath because that could be a life or death for the child. So, just, yeah, really, so they took that into account. I mean, granted, after the kid's born, you're unclean for a certain period of time, but hey. So there's all types of those things in there. And we think about it, when we read through the 5 books of Moses and we look at all of the commands, when we look at the different offerings and sacrifices in the first 5 chapters of Leviticus, when we get later in Leviticus and looking at the Day of Atonement, when we were talking about leprosy and dealing with that and cleansing a leper, when we're looking at women giving birth and all of these different things, when we consider the whole 5 books of Moses, there's about 613 commands that God gives in there, right? But then he's able to narrow down those 613 commands into just 10, which is the law, the formal written law, I guess we'll say, the 10 Commandments, right? Where the first half deals with kind of our relationship to God and the latter half dealing our relationship with fellow man. Okay? Then, so we've got 613 going down to 10. We get to the New Testament, and Christ, he boils those 10 down even more to just 2. right? Remember the young lawyer? He comes and asks him, it's like, what is the greatest? Or Jesus asked the lawyer, what's the greatest? And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So we go from 613 commands. Then God narrows it down to 10. And then Jesus comes along in the New Testament, God in the flesh, the Word made flesh, John 1 and verse 14, that he narrows it down to 2. And then it even gets narrowed down further in the New Testament. If we were to turn over from the Old Testament to the New Testament and look at Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13, verse 8. Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. For he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. That was Romans 13 and verse 8. Another one, Galatians chapter 5. Galatians chapter 5, verse 14. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So when we're looking at the law of God, again, 613 laws narrowed down to 10 commandments. Fast forward to the New Testament, narrowed down to 2 commandments, to loving God, loving your neighbor, then narrowed down even from 2 commandments to just a single word, and that is love. By this, all will know that you're my disciples. By what? Your love for one another. If you blank me, you will keep my commandments. If you what? Everything is fulfilled in just a single word of love. Loving God, loving people, right? Now we think of this idea of the Sabbath, and as we were reading there in Luke chapter 13, Luke 14, Mark chapter 3, and there are other occasions that we didn't read. The Pharisees had done the exact opposite, in that they took the 10 commands and then they looked at the whole of the 613, and then they added on 500 books in 22 volumes for people to deal with. For every one that God said, they added on 5 more. I mean, there are several reasons. Just that I think personally, I think, that there's the idea of having to actually seek God. Sure, but we also have to remember, one is that they did not have, the scriptures as we have them today, right? Even if we take away the rest of the Bible and we just have the 5 books of Moses, they still did not necessarily have access to them as we do today. They were there the scribes had made copies. They were kept in synagogues. They were kept sometimes, depending on maybe how big the city was, under lock and key. There was someone always guarding them. Not all Jews were literate. They taught a lot through song. When we look at the book of Psalms, for example, those are hymns. And many of them, when they were making their 3 pilgrimages to Jerusalem, they would sing those psalms on the way there and on the way back. A lot of it was taught orally. And so if you go for generations, especially, we've got 400, silent years between the Old and New Testament, generation after generation of this is what I'm told, this is what I'm told, this is what I'm told, well, this is what I'm going to believe. Even if it is access. Now, that's not unlike today. People have access to the entirety of God's Word. and they can read it for themselves. Even if they can't read, then there's audio versions. Even if they can't, there's volumes of the Bible that are in Braille. Even if they can't, even if, they were deaf and blind, then, there's the versions in Braille that they can get. And yet, how many people say, well, I don't really know why I believe what I believe. My dad, he was this. My granddad was this. You know what I'm saying? So really, it's not as uncommon as we might think. Just being taught that. Like I said, other reasons might be the idea that God wants people to actually seek Him, to look for Him, and not just have everything handed, to Him, even though He technically has handed everything to us, right? He's given us all things pertaining to life and godliness through what? Through a knowledge of Him, So we have everything that we need, but any thoughts or comments so far, or anybody want to jump in to? Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. And certain healings were prevented on the Sabbath. Certain healings were prevented because those healings might have required like grinding herbs or something like that, to make the ointment or what have you. But if we look at these accounts, even over here in Luke chapter 14, he took hold of him, there in verse 4, Jesus, he took hold of this man with dropsy, healed him, and sent him away. Even if we looked over in verse 13, or chapter 13, in verse 12, Jesus saw her, he called her over and said to her, "Woman, you're freed from your sickness." He laid hands on her and immediately was made erect again and began glorifying God. So there were certain types of healings that would have been prevented on the Sabbath because they would have included work, like the grinding of herbs and what have you. But Jesus didn't do any of that. All he did was lay hands on the person and pray for the person. Whether it was internally or externally, that's all he did. And prayer would not have been forbidden by anybody. Even on the Sabbath. If someone, think about it. A Pharisee is already separate from everybody else. If a Pharisee comes along and says, look, you can't even pray for people on the Sabbath, that is not going to go over well for anybody. And they're going to be hated even more than many people dislike them anyways. Right? So, and also, you might want to jot down Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12 and verse 12 specifically, because even in considering all of these healings and considering the minutia of everyday life, of even just taking an ox or a donkey out of the stall and over to the water, Matthew chapter 12 and verse 12, Christ is there saying, of how much more value then is a man than a sheep. He's just talked to them about, a sheep falling into the pit. But then he says, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. It is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. You think about it, 6 days of creation, and God rested, right? I think we all agree with the Genesis account there in Genesis 1 and 2. Question, after the 6 days of creation and God rested, did he rest from doing good? No, right? Not a trick question. God still went about doing good, So how different would we be? Yes, we have that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath there. There in, the idea, the Sabbath was not meant to be a burden to people. It wasn't to make slaves of the people. It was a sign of the covenant between God and man, as we read in Exodus. It was a time for rest, a time for worship, but it wasn't to be a burden. And the Pharisees, through adding all of these oral laws that just kept piling up and piling up, it made it a burden for the people. It's just like you said, I would not want to be a Jew during that time. Who would? I mean, really, who would? To have to follow all of these things, and they're not even all there. And so Jesus, he's healing. They're watching him closely there in Luke chapter 14. They're watching him closely to see if he's going to heal on the Sabbath. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Yes or no? And they're silent. They're silent because they don't have an answer for him. If it's lawful to heal on the Sabbath, then they can't accuse him of doing anything wrong. If it's not lawful, then they come across as being heartless. It's the same type of question that the Pharisees would pose to Christ many times. Any thoughts or comments? Sorry, I went over a couple of minutes, didn't intend to, but thoughts, comments? Make sense, kind of, a little bit? Understand the Sabbath a little bit more? On our Wednesday class, I'm not sure if it's going to be this upcoming Wednesday or the one following, we're going to look more on the Sabbath as to why we have the first day of the week and it's not Saturday, and we'll look at some other things that you could and could not do on the Sabbath just to kind of fill in the gaps a little bit. But I appreciate everybody's time and attention. Appreciate y'all being here. Glad you're well. And that's all she wrote. Well, all he wrote.